Hello, I'm talking about one of my favorite authors today, who is Susan Sontag, regarding the pain of others. I've only read 3 of her works, no, 4, I think 2 of them as audiobooks, but definitely some of them are ones that have stayed with me for a really long time. I actually read this back in 2019 or 2020, I forgot, but it's been a while, and I recently, it's not that I've been in a reading slump, but I've definitely not maybe read like a full book in a while, or a new book. It's not that I don't want to read it right now, but there are so many things that I currently want to do, like projects that I'm currently doing, that I don't mind that, readings kind of taking a, I guess, backstage, because there are times, like months, where all I want to do is read. So that's okay. I have so many books in my backlog that I can still go do a bit of kind of rejigging of memory and then talk about them. So that's what I did with this one. I've read this one, and I'm soon going to do a book review on Notes on Camp, which is another one of her books, and one that is a lot more popular than this one. But I do feel like, in general, if you want to pick up one of her books, I think this is a really good one to pick up. So let's talk about Susan Sontag. She was born in 1933 in New York, I believe, somewhere in the US, and she passed away in 2004. So I only got to know about her works about 5-6 years ago, so it's really not been that long. And I think I discovered her at the right age, because I was definitely at the point in my life where I could understand a lot of her works, because they are quite complex. She tends to gravitate towards writing a lot about war, commentary on war, and a lot of other topics that I would say are not easy to quite grasp. I mean, she has quite extensive works on AIDS, even the Vietnam War, on photography, and some of the lighter works like Notes on Camp. She's quite known to cover, I guess, talk about, write about areas of conflict, and even travel to them to cover them. So one of the, I guess, ones that I found really interesting to read about was the siege of Sarajevo. And I was actually in that area a couple of years ago. I was traveling, so I was in Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Montenegro, and I think I briefly visited Serbia for like just a day. So I didn't really, sadly, it wasn't a part of, like, a big part of my world history curriculum in school, so I didn't know a lot about it. But I found that because of Susan Sontag, I read up on it, and it was really heartbreaking. And this is something that's quite recent, and to visit the country after really put a lot of that into perspective. And she also covered the Vietnam War quite extensively. So this is why I feel like I discovered it at the right time. Maybe, high school would have been a great time to read her works too, but I'm not too mad about it, because I remember in high school I was not that into history, which I'll come back to actually, because I think there's a reason for that. If I could bring it down, or maybe boil it down into like 2 topics that she is very good at covering, I would say it's about like visual culture, so photography and TV, and then the other one is war. So the 2 coming together, it leads to really interesting pieces of work. And I think On Interpretation is one that I feel like should be a definite like read for everyone. There's another work on photography, which I feel like I read so many pieces of it here and there. I haven't sat down and read the whole book once. And then regarding the pain of others, so all of these feel like topics that would otherwise go unnoticed if you weren't so interested in, I guess, coverage or media coverage of wars around the world. And because they're quite different, I can see a lot of people being interested in one and not the other, which is what makes her commentary on it so unique. She was, I guess, actively writing and covering topics at a time where the world was seeing quite a shift. So obviously, we had the World War II, and then we had the Cold War, but we also had tons of things going on around the world, especially later during her career. A lot of the wars, I feel like, from the 80s and the 90s, and what happened to the world in the 80s and 90s, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia, are not heavily talked about. But it's a very televised period of time, starting from the Vietnam War. A lot, like, war stories and all of these became a part of our like living room scenario. She called it tele-intimacy with death and destruction, because before this, people really didn't have this like public access to so many images and depictions of war and atrocities. But now it's almost becoming a part of like a regular household to be able to access these images and understand war from a very, intimate perspective. So like the name suggests, regarding the pain of others is sort of a, I guess, exploration on our relationship with pain, with photography, and like the name suggests, the pain of others specifically. And initially, she goes around kind of talking about pain in general and photography, because she talks about how, obviously, like having access to all of these images, what does it actually do to us? And initially, the book begins with her talking about like, even pacifists, people who don't really believe in war, or like the fact that they don't really want war to be a thing in the world anymore, they too accept that it's not really something that, just by showing people images of war, it's not something that can be totally removed. So if it is not to, I don't know, deter people from war, what is the true reason for it? And you can say that to a certain extent we do live in a world where, the amount of wars have come down. But, the reason for that might be that the nature of warfare has changed, not that war has typically, gone away. And then she talks about, what is the true purpose of this? Is it just to document it? Because what these photos do is essentially show us like a very barbaric version of war. So that means like a lot of, actually what's happening at the tail end of it. And if you don't know, I come from a part of India that still, sees this on a regular basis. Recently, we had a huge, I don't want to call it a situation, but it was just absolutely horrifying what happened in Manipur. If you want to look it up, actually please look it up, because the more people that learn about this, and the reason I'm a bit skeptical to even say this is because I don't know how much of what is available online is truly reliable, which again brings back to the question of what is the point of televising or showing all of these things, because it can be twisted in many ways. And if it is to make people feel pain and feel the pain of others, or is it to in a certain way desensitize them? Because I feel like when I look at pictures from Manipur, when I look at pictures from things that are happening back home, I feel a different sensation to when I see images of war in other parts of the world, because this is very true, very raw to me. But the rest of it, I don't have the same reaction. Even if I feel like, I'm a major pacifist, I don't believe that wars, it's not that I don't believe in wars, because you can't just not believe in something that's real life, but I obviously don't see the point in it. I'm someone who is very actively involved in learning about different cultures, about the world, and I feel like I have more or less some form of exposure to a lot of different cultures. But even then, I feel like the feeling that you have for where you are from and your own people, it's always going to be a lot more visceral and a lot stronger. So when we see images depicted of wars in like foreign land, does it bring it closer and make it more real, or does it make it even further? Does it almost give it this whole like film-like feeling to it and make it more other than it already is? In certain cultures, war is also depicted as a way to kind of unite people. So to kind of charge people up with this sense of patriotism, like look at what's happening to your people, and then bring them together. And in this sense, especially when you think about the time when she was growing up, or the time when she was actively writing, a lot of the imagery and portrayal of war was used as part of propaganda and to, push a certain narrative. And this is why she wrote these works, to, encourage people to be a bit more skeptical, to be a bit more, I guess, understand the nuances behind these depictions and why they're being shared publicly in the first place and what narrative it's trying to push. There's also this other part of it, which is like the question behind ethical implications of turning like human suffering into like visual, I guess, something that for people to consume, which doesn't really sit right with her either. And I think that's really fair, because in a way, like, I understand why it's so important to be able to see, because when you see something in a picture format, it makes it a lot more real, and I'm never going to deny that. But at the same time, we as society are being desensitized to it. So she's not really providing like a solution in between, but just asking people to be a bit more conscious of the context. And in this sense, she talks a lot about like the framing. Obviously, a photograph is framed, and that means that there is things that exist outside of the frame. So unless we get the full context, a picture in itself can be quite misleading. And that's why, like, even if we're to even second guess or take a second look and actually think like, okay, this is what I'm seeing, but I wonder what existed kind of around it, or what the rest of the story is. She also says that photography has a very strong, I guess, role to play in shaping our modern understanding of war and also of different cultures. And I think this is so true, which is going back to when I was in high school. A lot of the history books were of really little interest to me. They felt incredibly biased and incredibly boring. And I remember thinking back then in school, like, a lot of that was like black and white imagery, and it made me feel like it was also distant and like long time in the future, right? But as I grew up, I was like, really, it's really not that long ago, and it can happen so easily again. And what was the point in putting so many things in black and white, tiny little, pixelated images, when this literally happened? Even like images of Cold War, I remember in the book, were like tiny and black and white. And this is in books that had colored imagery, by the way. It's not that the whole book was just pixelated and tiny, which had this like way of like making it more distant, like I said, than it actually was. And another part is, it really made me question my own understanding and interpretation of the world and wars and countries, because I feel like somehow current depiction of wars in certain countries, or like, people think like certain countries in Africa are just constantly, at war and like civil war, and it's like really, really dangerous. And same with like India. And like, the thing is, these depictions do cast a light. Like, maybe didn't happen at the time when she was writing this book, but 50 years later, people are, rightfully so in certain cases, scared to go to certain countries, and they almost feel like this is the reality of certain countries, poorer countries, and they almost taken it as like, okay, this is just how it is. Whereas it didn't have to be like that. If people were maybe more sympathetic, that so this doesn't have to be the reality that so many countries live with, things might have been different. Obviously, she doesn't go into like what role photography specifically has to play in making Western societies look on many like African or Eastern societies, I guess, as dangerous, or just politically, like, always in mess. But that is how it's often portrayed, and this is the almost become reality over time. And I think this is one of the most interesting topics that she covers, is that, even if something is reframed or taken out of context at the time, over time it can become historical evidence. We don't know 1,000 years later how a particular photo from this time is going to be interpreted. We don't have any control unless it's been documented, or someone might be falsely documenting these as something else, and that is how people will believe it to be. So yeah, all of that to say that, this book really raises really interesting questions about the just taking things at a face value and not evaluating them, and not really thinking deeply and critically about things. And also how much of our interpretation is also influenced by our own personal biases, how we grew up, our understanding of the world, and how those things are also just as important to take into consideration when we are evaluating or looking at certain pieces of work or certain pieces of art. We go to a gallery, we see photos, and how we interpret it is dependent on us, right? So we have to be more actively critical of what we're seeing. As a last point, I wanted to kind of put in there, because this is what came into my mind when I was reading this book. Like, I thought about, like, historically, where do we see this type of, like, before photos, people still had art, and this is more, I guess, manufactured horror in a way. And she talks about that very briefly, but my main thing came back to like religion, and how religion has, for long before war and photography, used art as a medium to portray images which are like obviously not fact. These are just okay, nobody knows, but most of it, like images of hell and what happens to people who do bad things, and in a way to like almost instill fear in people. And I feel like this photography and Warren is just a modern conversation on that, where it's already been used over, I guess, centuries to manipulate and, you know, put forward a certain narrative, whereas now it's the same thing, but it's just a slightly more advanced medium that people question less because it's quote unquote, you know, stated in fact. So I don't think it's anything new, but it definitely is a conversation with which will forever be relevant as long as we continue to share through this visual medium what's happening in the world. I think we are becoming very critical as society on what we're seeing, especially with the advent of AI. I think this conversation could not be more relevant, where everything can now be manufactured, everything can be put up to look like anything. I mean, it's hard nowadays as someone who does not specialize in AI imagery or anything like that. Sometimes even I find it difficult to distinguish what is real and what is not. So whatever you consume, just be, you know, really mindful about it. Think about it a little more deeply. And it's hard because we as humans, whatever we see, we do intend to, you know, believe in that because our eyes are seeing it. Like, I won't believe it until I see it, right? But even now, I guess that's being debunked, because even if you see it, you might not always, or you should not always believe it. But yeah, I'll leave the review there. I'll see you guys in the next video. Might do another Sontag video if you guys enjoyed this one. And yeah, see you next Sunday. Bye.